Good morning to everybody, to all assistants and visitors to this cátedra. Today, we are going to have the presentation of Professor Dr. Peter Bratsis. He's doctor in political sciences and actually is associate professor of City University of New York, and also he's member of Institute of the Radical Imagination. Then, as you know, you can see this video in YouTube, and also you can see this video in the web chat, in the web page of the cátedra. Thank you so much, Professor Peter Bratsis, for attending our invitation, and the floor is yours, Peter Bratsis, Dr. Peter Bratsis.
Thank you, Nicholas. I want to thank you for coordinating this and helping to set it up, and of course, I want to thank everybody for the invitation and for being invited to speak. I think my talk will be focused on an anatomy of the ideas of corruption. What do we mean by corruption? Because one peculiarity with the discourse on corruption is that is used by everybody, far right, left, middle, everyone uses the discourse on corruption. And oftentimes it can be quite confusing because it refers at times to very disparate kind of phenomena. And I think people don't necessarily realize the different ways that it's used and how it can be, people use it one way, but then when people hear it, they interpret it in a very different way. The first way in which the term corruption was used, or the concept of corruption emerged, was as a way to denote something that became less good, something that decayed. So, for example, something to corrode in that sense, like when the metal corrodes, it's a corruption. In Latin, of course, the term corruption and the term corrosion are the same, is the same root. In ancient Greek too, it had that same meaning. Something was corrupted in the sense that it was less able to do what it was supposed to do. If you got sick, it was a kind of corruption. You were less capable of achieving your goals, or working properly. When it came to politics, of course, we have maybe the most famous discussion of corruption in the ancient world is by Aristotle in the Politics, when he talks about three forms of a constitution, three ways in which political communities can be constituted, kingship, aristocracy, and polity, or a kind of polyarchy, and then corrupted forms, which is to say when something goes wrong and this thing has been made not impure, because we'll talk about that in a minute, but has decayed and has gone from working properly to no longer working as it was intended. It's a kind of corrosion. This was the dominant way in which corruption was understood up until the early modern period. And in the early modern period, at least in terms of politics, corruption began being used in a way that did not denote something that was in itself a bad. So for Aristotle, for example, oligarchy is always bad. When you have the corruption of aristocracy into oligarchy, it's always a negative. There's nothing positive about oligarchy, let's say. In the modern era, corruption comes more and more to denote not something that goes from being a good to a bad, but something that in itself is good maybe, but it's in the wrong place, something that is out of place. Which is also an idea we find in the classical world, in the ancient world, not applied to politics so much, but we see it very clearly in Leviticus, in the Old Testament, where is a question of course, as you probably know, the ban on certain kinds of things, wearing cloth made from two kinds of fibers, eating things that come from the ocean but which aren't fish, or things that come from the skies but which aren't birds, and so forth. There are many, many rules there. The meaning of them, the reason why all these rules exist, is as a way of maintaining the purity of the categories through which the world is given some kind of meaning, some kind of order. So the idea is that not to confuse things, not to make things blurry and opaque. So we have, like in Leviticus, the reason why you can't eat things in the ocean that aren't fish is because these are things that might live in the ocean, but they're out of place. They're more like something that should be living on land. So if you eat a crab or a lobster, it's something more like it should be living on the land. When it comes from the sea, it's out of place. So that's a kind of corruption. Some locusts, you can eat them because they don't fly, they hop. So is a method of movement that is proper to the earth. If they fly, they're unclean because they have a way of moving that is only proper to the birds, not to the locusts. So in the early modern period and later, we have, in addition to the idea of corruption in Aristotle, which is something that decays, becomes less good, less potent, less capable, we have the idea of corruption as something out of place, which is very, very fundamental, of course, also today, because it refers to fundamentally the categories of the public and the private. As we have the emergence of the modern state, and we have the organization of social life through the categories of public and private, because as we all know, the distinction between public and private is fundamental to the way that the modern state is organized and functions, denotes different kinds of law, public law and private law, denotes how we distinguish certain kinds of spaces, what makes something a public space, a private space, what kind of rules apply where you can be, where you can't be, and so forth. Just like, of course, in Leviticus with these ideas of what is proper to the ocean, proper to the air, proper to the land, and so forth. So these things have to be kept separate, pure in a sense, uncontaminated. And there emerge rules, which did not exist before, that begin to distinguish between us as private citizens versus us as private, public people, in the sense of you hold a position in the state, or you are paid by the state, let's say, or you're a politician, in ways to make sure that distinction is always, kept. So a lot of the corruption rules, if you read them, whether it be in Colombia or the United States or anywhere else, you'll see many of the corruption rules are about not contaminating the public and the private. So, for example, what's the problem with bribery? That you are using your public position to benefit personally, right? Is an improper presence of the private and the public. Now, in modern societies, the ethic is always that we should be as self-interested and utilitarian as possible. The modern ethic, and this is again in great contrast to pre-modern times, it's considered a good. It's not the bad thing that you want to make a lot of money. It's a good thing. The liberal ethic is you should be as competitive, self-interested as possible, and that way society benefits the most. That way the market is in balance, you have the maximum use of nature for human needs, and so forth. But not in the public. This is only for the marketplace. This is only for the marketplace. If you are in the public, then that's not the ethic that you should be guided by. Then you're not there as a private individual the way you are in the marketplace. Different rules apply. And there are then all those limitations on what you can do as a public official or someone in the public sphere. And again, that's where we see all these different rules about bribery, if you can hire your relatives, let's say, or not. For example, here in the United States, you're not allowed to hire your relatives if you're a member of the Congress. If you're in the American Congress, you can't use the money that's given to you for a staff to hire your relatives, for example. And you can't use the money you raised for your campaign to pay for things. Because when you are a political candidate, you are neither public nor private, in a sense. It is a very interesting in-between. You're in-between. So whatever money you raise for a campaign, you can't use it personally. You can't say, Donald Trump, for example, can't say, I raised $100 million for my campaign, but I'm not going to run for any more offices, so I get to keep the money. Can't do that. Nor can you say, I'm going to spend it, I'm going to give it to the local museum as a donation. You can only use it for campaign purposes. The only thing you can do with that money is either use it yourself for a campaign or give it to somebody else to use in their campaigns. Just a second. So this is again, it was a new way, different way of understanding corruption, which is something that's out of place. And it was, again, fundamentally tied to the rise of the nation state and keeping categories clean. Now, the significance of this is that sometimes we say something is corrupt and we mean it in the old way, that there is some kind of deterioration, something that in itself is bad. So, for example, in Greece, for example, still, the word for corruption, which is the same as it was in the ancient world, διαφθορά, for example, they will use it if a politician is caught in some kind of a scandal, they were having an affair, which would not fit the way it's used oftentimes in the United States, because that might be a scandal, obviously, it might be something, but it would not be a corruption in the sense that it is an improper presence of the private within the public. It would be a moral failing, let's say, of the politician. And this is important because when they do different measures of corruption and they ask people, how corrupt do you think your government is, or how corrupt are politicians? Some people say they're very corrupt, but they mean not always in the same sense. They might mean that, oh, they are not very trustworthy and they lie, or they have affairs, or they drink a lot, whatever, that can be a form of corruption for them, as opposed to they are taking bribes, or they are there just to make a lot of money for themselves. So that's the second idea of corruption. So we have corruption as decay, we have corruption as something that's out of place, and then we have a much more recent notion of corruption, which is corruption as a lack of transparency, corruption as opacity, something that is opaque. And this becomes very prominent from the early 90s onwards. We have founded in Germany, but of course it spreads to the rest of the world, the organization Transparency International, which was the first major international organization to be founded for the purpose of fighting corruption, of battling corruption. And the idea there, and it was partly begun by people from the World Bank, and others. Their thinking was that, well, the reason why we have many problems in the world today is because of corruption, and we have to eradicate corruption. But with that, what they meant by that is that you have regimes where there's a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, and that discourages investment coming from the outside. So from the standpoint of these, of what we could call transnational capital, let's say, capital that is in constant movement around the globe, corruption is an issue. Why? Because on the one level, you think, well, if some regime is happy to accept a bribe, it should be great for capitalism, because they can, it saves a lot of time potentially and a lot of messiness. Pay the bribe and do whatever you want to do, no problem. The problem is unpredictability from the standpoint of the people outside. So when capital comes from the outside, they want to know how everything works, what are the costs and what are the benefits. So one of the, beyond Transparency International, one of the other organizations that began dealing with corruption in the 90s was the investment firm PricewaterhouseCoopers, where they came up with an index to tell you what would be the costs of investing in various parts of the world because of a lack of transparency. So you could sign on to that service and they would tell you the cost of investing in China, figure in an additional 35% as an opacity tax. Costs that you can't predict maybe beforehand, but know that it will cost you about that much in the future because laws can change very quickly, or some people might demand bribes from you, or whatever the case may be. It's an additional cost to what will be the explicit known costs. And of course, I think it was also a way to sever the ties in the various regimes around the world between the local elites and the state, so that transnational capital had a much easier access to investing in these various places. So it's three different notions of corruption. So something can be understood as being corrupt simply because there's a lack of transparency. And that is the most recent, and still it is a growing, I think, and very important way in which corruption is understood, and is very, very powerful. There are many, many, many studies, mostly by economists, but not only, that attempt to explain all the major problems of the world as an outcome of corruption. Africa is poor because it is corrupt, which to me at least is a repetition of the old colonialist discourse. You know, the poor regions of the world are poor because they have some defect. They are not civilized. They are too corrupt. They don't know how to run a proper bureaucracy and encourage investments and so forth. So it is a very, I think, useful, especially in the post-communist, let's say, once you have the fall of communism and capitalism is the only game left in town, how do you explain these inequalities, these disparities around the world? And this has become, on the one hand, the dominant way to explain things that are unequal, but also a discourse to attempt to change states around the world to better reflect the structures demanded by transnational capitalism, so capital can more easily move in and out, invest and disinvest, knowing in a much more predictable way the costs and the benefits of those decisions. So we have these three concepts. And again, you know, if you read an article by the people in Transparency International and they're talking about corruption, it's going to mean something very different than if you're reading a court case where some politician was charged with corruption. And by the way, we should note, and this is not a minor point, that nowhere is there a law against corruption as such. There is no country in the world, that I know of at least, there was in Australia for a time had some rules, but they got rid of them. There was no country in the world that has a legal ban on corruption in any kind of ecumenical way. A ban on the use of public office for private gain, for example. Because in essence, of course, contemporary politics is only that. What is contemporary politics? Each of us try to advance our private interests in the sphere of politics. I vote for someone because I think they will benefit me, and you do the same, and so on down the line. That's all we have today, in a sense, in bourgeois politics, is these clashes of private interests. So it's only some forms of that that's considered a corruption. You know, this problem really goes to the heart of the instability of the categorical constitution of the modern state, that we have in terms of idea separation public and private, but in reality these things are not separate, you know, because all the public is a clash of private interests, is the struggle between private attempts to increase utilities. So in order to police that otherwise very, very blurry, indistinguishable line, you have only some examples of private regarding in the public as being illegal. So, for example, you know, there is usually, if you give a gift, for example, I think in almost all the countries, if it's you and someone who is a friend of yours or relative of yours who happens to be a politician, it's acceptable. If your wife is the prime minister and you give her a gift, it is not an example of corruption. If it's not your wife who's the prime minister and you give her a small gift, you give her a book, it's usually not corruption because it's not worth a lot of money. There is often a amount of money that's tied to the gift that if you go beyond that, it's considered to be inappropriate. It becomes an example of corruption, because the idea is it's being given as a way to induce, to bias their judgment on something potentially. But if it's another head of state, let's say, who gives a gift, if the Prime Minister of Canada visits, you know, England and they give the Prime Minister of Britain a gift, it's not corruption because it's a public-to-public transaction, not a private-to-public or public-to-private. So you have all these categories there. So you have maybe some rules on bribes, maybe you have some rules on nepotism, Maybe you have some rules about what kind of jobs you can do as when you're in government. You know, if you're a member of parliament, you cannot work for someone else, or you can do work for someone else, but only up to X amount of money per year you can get paid, because beyond that, then it's like they are inducing you by paying you the money. So it's it's a very interesting phenomenon that nowhere is there a law against corruption, because if there were, in fact, a law against corruption, it would in effect outlaw all of modern politics. Because when a senator or a member of parliament votes against or for law because some interests in their district would benefit, this would be then a corruption, because they're using their public position to advance private interests. Because some factory that happens to be in their district would benefit, they push for it. By the way, in the ancient world, this was always banned. This was always not allowed in the ancient democracies. So in Athens, for example, if you were there wasn't a parliament, but if you were a citizen and you were, of course, engaged in public issues, political debates, if you had some interest in something, you were excluded from the discussion. You were kept out, because the idea was that self-interest would be too strong, and you would not be able to think about that issue in terms of what would be good for the city. So you were excluded. Today's logic is exactly the opposite. If you have a strong interest, if you are a quote-unquote stakeholder in the issue, you should have a seat at the table to make the decision. Because again, the modern idea is private interests are good. It's good to be self-interested, and this is what we do in politics. But again, this conflicts when you have the emergence of the idea of the public interest, the common good, and like I said, most of the time, the corruption rules that we see in law are about that relationship, maintaining that division between the categories of public and private, even though in reality these things can never be separated in any kind of substantive way. So for me, I think whenever we speak of corruption, we have to first ask ourselves, what does the term refer to? Are we referring to some kind of Trump, for example, is corrupt because he is a liar and he cheats and he does all these things? Are we talking about corruption as the improper presence of the private within the public? Or are we talking corruption as a lack of transparency? And then typically, because it's often the second and the third way, then the discourse on corruption often attempts to trump any serious political discussion or debate. If I say something is corrupt, it's taken automatically as meaning that this is something that is undesirable. Whereas, in the first case, of course, it means that, something that is decayed, but in the other two, it's an open question. Because just because something is out of place in terms of the formal categories, the same way, let's say, when we talk about the Leviticus, a crab or a lobster might be out of place from the standpoint of the categories embodied in Leviticus, but maybe it's very good, might be tasty, might be nutritious. If I have to give a bribe when I go to the hospital, it might be a corruption from the standpoint of these things, but maybe it's a better system than others where it wouldn't be, where you don't have bribes, but they function much less well. So in the American case, for example, of course, as many people know, there are many people who are who completely lack health insurance, health coverage. Other places, Greece, for example, everyone has health insurance, but oftentimes you have to give a bribe to get decent care. You have to give some extra incentive. that they don't treat you in a dispassionate way, but they have some greater interest in treating you well. So maybe it costs you money to give the bribe, but maybe the money you give as a bribe is much less and the service much better than if you were here with no insurance and then you get a bill for $100,000 from the hospital. So maybe the one is legal, the other one is illegal, or it's a gray area, but it might be better, if you compare the two. So I think too often the word corruption is used as a way to preclude any serious discussion about the substantive issue by saying this is something that is corrupt and thus we should all be against it. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. There should maybe always be, a broader dissection of what's going on, a deeper discussion to make the argument as to why something is good or bad. I don't know, but I think we may be time-wise,
Okay.
have a lot of time where
As you want, Professor Bratsis. It's as you want, no worries. Thank you. Also, I have some questions regarding with your presentation. Just let me begin with an issue that is completely known for all of us. We have seen that in current times, this kind of authoritarian or pro-authoritarian leaders are on the rise. We can see a lot of examples all around the world regarding with this kind of leaders that people just say, or at least some people say, that they are a little bit against democracy, or at least they have a lot of authoritarian trends within their politics. My question is, this kind of meanings of corruption that you have described to us, this kind of authoritarian leaders make a change or not in these conceptions or concepts of corruption, or these kind of authoritarian leaders in current times are also just politicians as usual in modern times. There is a difference between the behaviors developed by authoritarian leaders compared with other leaders, or there is no difference taking into account the concept of corruption?
No, I think there's no difference in the concept of corruption, but there is a difference in the emphasis and how they use, because all of them, as I'm sure you have noticed, all of them are against corruption in a very strong way. Bolsonaro, Trump, all these characters talk about corruption. Trump famously, I will go to Washington, drain the swamp, get rid of all the corruption, all the special interests there, and so forth. And they use it in the second way I meant, but not necessarily in a kind of legalistic, oh, you have violated the rules when it comes to gifts or something. They mean that there is an impurity in society. They understand an attempt to explain to people the problem in the society is because there is an improper presence in our society. So Trump's his whole slogan, "Make America Great Again," which came, let's not forget, only a few years after he was the leader in this attempt to present Barack Obama as having been born in Africa and smuggled in when he was a baby, in improper presence. So the idea for Trump and for the others is that traditional values, the traditional American society, has been corrupted because there's too many immigrants. You know, they have always the arguments. Just last week, there was a newspaper article that blamed many of the problems today on Herbert Marcuse, for example. And you see, if you know a little bit, you see that is this old idea. Oh, is these Jewish cosmopolitan intellectuals who come here and they cause trouble, they have corrupted the youth, they have corrupted the universities, and we have to clean them. In France, as you probably know, the last couple of weeks, the French have declared they want to clean up the universities from these crazy postmodern theories, critical theories that come from the outside, and the universities are teaching. Of course, here they say the opposite, right? And I think here they're more accurate, because what we teach in the universities, there's no American thinker, really, original American thinker, I don't know, maybe since John Dewey. Everything we teach here is basically French, and then you have, of course, also a lot of Germans, once in a while some Italians and so forth, but it's all French theory. That's all we teach. Althusser, Deleuze, all these kinds of things. And the French say, no, it's the Americans who have exported these ideas to our universities. So, is a crazy, of course, process going on. But always there is this attempt to present the problems that occur as something, a corruption, an impurity that has been introduced into the society or in the culture. It's communists and atheists, it's immigrants and foreigners, whatever the case might be. And again, whenever you hear this, of course, then you have to grab your gun, when you hear these arguments, because it is an attempt, again, to short circuit any serious political discussion and to present a cartoonish, simple, moralistic notion. Oh, the problems are because of an improper presence of something in our society, and we have to purify it, to cleanse it in some way. So it's a very reactionary, it is inherently a conservative argument being made. And by the way, many times on the people who might think themselves to be on the left make similar arguments, but with not as dangerous certainly, but with a different idea. The idea, for example, that there is today about cultural appropriation, that you can appropriate a culture. It also presupposes as a kind of purity. So you can only make a taco if you're Mexican. If you're not Mexican, you make a taco, then you have appropriated another culture. As if the taco itself was not itself a product of many, many appropriations. It comes from the Middle East, the immigrants go to Mexico, of course it changes somewhat, the ingredient changes somewhat. When it goes then to California, it changes and so forth. Always cultures are hybrid, They are being appropriated and reappropriated and modified. And there's no pure, the idea of a pure culture, of a self-enclosed, hermetically sealed culture is a fantasy. Never existed, never will exist. And it's good, of course. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing that this is the way it works. So even, of course, on the left, there's the so-called left. There are these tendencies towards this kind of essentialist thinking, the idea that you can have a pure culture and it can be contaminated because someone takes it from you, appropriates it from you. I think this is also a falsity, but of course not dangerous the way that these conservative politicians use it, which, because they have guns, much more dangerous because they have the apparatus of the state and all the guns. So the consequences are much more dire.
Yes, and other question at the end of your presentation, if I understood properly, you said that this kind of concepts or conceptions of corruption, these ideas of the public and the private, as usually we use this kind of terms. You said the idea of corruption is trying to hide something. Usually behind the idea of corruption is something that it's not clear. Then you can just explain to us a little bit better which is the role or which is the function of this kind of species regarding with corruption. Usually, as you told us, when an authoritarian leader just use this kind of word, of course, has a certain purposes to follow. Maybe when a certain ONG, where certain civil society groups just use the same word, they just try to follow other kind of interest. Then, what is behind this kind of conception of corruption? In your opinion, what is hiding between this distinction, of course, this fast distinction between the public and the private, as is used in this corruption species?
Well, I think one thing that it hides, if you compare the state, the nation state, as we know it, as it has developed in the last 600-700 years or whatever, to pre-modern political forms. I always use, the Athenian, not only because I'm from Athens, but, is always a useful contrast because it's so unlike what we have today, in a sense. What was common for the Athenians, what tied them together was not interests. Interests were always different because you have a different class position, because you have a different profession, because whatever, you always had differences. What was common was that they lived together. What is common in the pre-modern world, what makes a community is that they live together. You see? Now, the argument today is not that. The argument is what ties us together is interests, common interests, the public good, the public interest. Which is what? Here we have a problem. Because once you try to find, well, what is that ties us together? How are we tied together? It is exactly that which is not common to us, that is presented as the common today. Because again, contemporary politics is all about conflicts of interests. That's the lifeblood of politics. So you have this strange metaphysical situation where what is beyond, you can go back to Rousseau, for example, who is the most elaborate articulator of this unusual relationship. When it says what is the general will? So the general will is once you add up everyone's individual interests and preferences and so forth, and you balance them out, you negate them, whatever is left over is the general interest. Whatever remains is a general interest. That's the common. But we know this is a kind of nothing in particular. Is like saying, okay, we are private citizens, which again, from the standpoint of the classical world, is a contradiction. How can you be a private citizen? If you're a citizen, it is always in concert with the other citizens in the city. But as a private citizen, presumably, we have our individual interests. Your friends, my friends, your careers and so forth. But beyond that, it's just like in Rousseau, beyond all these particularities, we are all members of the body politic. We are all one, united as this a body of citizens. But again, this is always nowhere to be found. It is a kind of empty, formal common. It is not a real, substantive common. Again, if we go back to Marx on the Jewish question, we see a very similar argument. What do you have in bourgeois society? The right to live in isolation as a member of civil society is not the right to come together as a collective community to function politically. So I think this is the gap, that we have today a society of radically alienated and divided people who pretend they live as a community through this abstract notion of the public, and these corruption rules help maintain, I think, the illusion of the public in a world where everything, of course, is completely privatized, completely in the realm of civil society. So it does perform, I think, a significant function in terms of the legitimation of contemporary bourgeois politics. These corruption, that notion of corruption, of course, in the way it's materialized in various rules and policies, that you have this notion of we are all come together. And of course you have one reason, for example, why things like clientelism become problematic. Because you could say on one level, okay, how is clientelism any worse than giving a campaign contribution? Because in clientelism, you vote for someone, you have your patron, and in exchange they do things for you and so forth. How are things different? And they're not different on that level, but they're different when it comes to bureaucracy. Because one of the lived experiences that maintains this illusion of the body politic, of the common, is that when you interact with the state, when you have to go to some bureaucracy to do something, they treat you the same as everybody else. They treat you indifferently. They don't care who you are, what village you're from, who your parents are, what your occupation is. They treat you indifferently. That gives, again, the illusion of this commonality, makes it more believable. As we know, is usually they treat you poorly or equally poorly. It's not as if, well, we love dealing with the state, how nice to be treated so equally. But that's part, I think, of this legitimizing function. This notion, the fetish, I call it, of the public, that we pretend that there is this commonality, and we have different ways of acting that out, one of which is through these sometimes very elaborate rules about what constitutes a bribe or a corruption or not.
Yes, thank you so much for your time, Professor Peter Bratsis. Thank you so much again for being with us. And for all the audience, I remember you that you can see this speech in YouTube and also in the webpage of this course. And next week we are going to have other presentations regarding with other interesting topics. And because we are in Corona times, just please be healthy, and we hope to see you the next time. And thank you so much. Thank you so much again, Professor Bratsis, for your time.
Thank you very much.